and we'll get going. Hello, and a very warm welcome to today's talk. My name, if you haven't encountered me before, is Bethany Gaunt. I'm Associate Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. The centre was founded about 5 years ago in memory of the late British historian. And alongside the series of talks we host, like this one tonight, which we do online throughout the academic year, we also offer resources and CPD for secondary history teachers, specifically to help them integrate Jewish history into their teaching. We're a small charity, but I hope you will agree that we achieve a significant amount and succeed in bringing history alive in the way that Sir Martin did so very well. If you would like to support our work and help us expand our outreach, please do consider donating on our website. I'll share the link shortly. Anyone with an interest in all things Churchillian, of which I suspect there are a great number joining us tonight, must surely have encountered the work of Sir Martin Gilbert. An official biographer of Sir Winston, Gilbert also wrote more than a dozen books on the British Premier. So we are always delighted to welcome scholars to share new insights on Churchill. And today it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. Elliot Clark. Elliot is currently working on his PhD on fatherhood in early 20th century British politics, using Churchill as a key case study. He's based at the University of Plymouth, where he was awarded a first-class degree in history. Tonight's talk is on a subject many of you have requested, Clementine Churchill, and takes inspiration from Elliot's undergraduate dissertation. The talk, as you should know, is entitled The Shadowed Advisor, The Role of Clementine Churchill. The Centre really loves to provide a space for early career historians to share their research, and I'm sure you will have lots of questions for Elliot about his work. So if you could post those in the chat, either publicly or to me privately, we'll get through as many of those as possible after Elliot's presentation. But for now, all that's left for me to say is sit back, enjoy the talk, and over to you, Elliot.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. I will just share my screen a moment so you can see the presentation. Can you all see that okay? Perfect. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to everyone for attending today's event. It's a real honour to be invited to speak with the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre today and to share my research with so many of you. As has been said, today's talk, I will be discussing the life of Clementine Churchill and a brief overview of how vital her influence was to the success of her husband, Winston Churchill's political career. The key points of discussion will be around the two world wars, but also with some insight into the interwar period and post-war period. In doing so, I'll be assessing Clementine's political skills and how she was able to shine in such a male-dominated political world. But before I start with all this, I want to give some background to my research and how I actually came to study Clementine Churchill. For me personally, my aim as a historian is to view and assess the life of a politician through those around them, whether that be colleagues, secretaries, family members, or even at times the childhood nannies. I believe that in doing so, we can actually improve our understanding of a figure's life as we assess them through a new viewpoint. Now, I started my study of the Churchill family 5 years ago now as an undergraduate student, as has been said, and this was after a visit to Chartwell, the family home of the Churchills, somewhere I'm sure many of those in the audience have visited, but if you haven't, then I'd certainly recommend going. At the time of my first visit in 2018, there was an exhibition on display which was titled Clementine Churchill Speaking for Herself. Now, this exhibition really stood out to me as so few of the biographies of Churchill really discussed Clementine or her role in Churchill's life. I left Chartwell that day really wanting to discover even more about Clementine, but more specifically, her political role. This trip to Chartwell resulted in forming my undergraduate dissertation, assessing Clementine's political role, but also the implications this commitment had on the couple's marriage. And it's this dissertation which will form much of the discussion today. When looking at the vast amount of historiography produced on Churchill, as I've already said, Clementine is rarely mentioned in any of them, with only a select few truly recognising her significance. To uncover Clementine's role, In aiding her husband's political career, I conducted my research at the Churchill Archive Centre in Cambridge. Now, I've said on several occasions that the Churchill Archive Centre is like an Aladdin's cave of material for a political historian, holding material which possesses stories of some of the most pivotal events in history. I must thank the Churchill Archives at this point for allowing me to use some of the material and images which we will see in today's talk. And I must also thank the Jenny Churchill Fund, which supported me for my undergraduate research and allowed me to facilitate my research in the archives. Now, to look at Clementine. For over 50 years, Clementine was at the side of one of the most influential figures of the 20th century and stands as a witness to some of the most turbulent events in British history. Throughout their 57 years of marriage, Clementine performed not only as a wife, but as a diplomat and political advisor. And like her husband, she always put the nation's interests before her own. She was one of few people Churchill would truly listen to and trust, as she stood as his most vital advisor throughout his career, despite her role widely remaining in the shadows. It was historian Roger Hermiston who stated that Winston Churchill, to quote, understood the mind of Hitler. My hopes with today's talk is to demonstrate that it was Clementine who understood the mind of Churchill, and that, as General Ismay once claimed, without Clementine, the history of Winston Churchill and of the world would have been a very different story. So, from the outset of their marriage in 1908, Clementine was plunged into this political world which her husband was entangled in. From an early stage, Churchill himself actually acknowledged the difficulties Clementine would face and the implications his commitment to politics could have on their marriage. In a letter to Clementine, he in fact wrote, to quote, I'm so centred in my politics that I often feel I must be a dull companion to anyone who is not in the trade. However, despite his initial concerns, Clementine threw herself into that trade, actively involving herself in all aspects of political life, whether that be actively campaigning on her husband's behalf or listening to his speeches from the gallery of the House of Commons. Clementine seemed to share in the excitement of political work, as it united the couple behind a single aim, forging Churchill's career to great heights and reaching the premiership. This commitment to his career came from Clementine's deep love for her husband, something which is apparent throughout their marriage. In April 1908, Clementine wrote to Churchill's mother, Jenny Churchill, to quote, I feel no one can know him, even as little as I do, without being dominated by his charm and brilliancy. Now, to assess her role, there are two distinctive parts to Clementine's support for her husband. In the early years of the Churchill marriage, we observe Clementine defend her husband's honour, both publicly and privately, pushing for him to reach high office. Compared to in those post-war years and post-premiership, when Clementine actively tried to protect his wartime legacy and prevent harm being caused to his reputation. Mary Soames, the youngest daughter of the Churchills, describes that in Clementine, Churchill found a valuable counsellor who he trusted and listened to as she provided a critical faculty and lofty integrity. In public life, Clementine's role was significant, but her influence in private was just as vital, but far well less known. For example, from the start of his career, Churchill tackled the difficulty of a speech impediment, and what Clementine's biographer, Jack Fishman, refers to as the anger heard in his accent of brutality, which dominated his speeches. Clementine at this stage observed how members mercilessly mocked her husband in the House of Commons, and the pain and torment he felt as a result, often leaving the House rather emotional. Seeking support at this stage, Winston would confide in his wife, showing her drafts of his speeches. Honest with her thoughts always, Clementine was critical of Churchill when appropriate. For example, on reviewing one of his speeches, she urged something like, I would not say that, Winston, when he'd used offending phrasing. It was her caution and understanding which helped build Churchill's speaking skills even further and created the famous orator which so many remember today. As his speeches improved, Churchill's popularity in the House also increased, as members began to acknowledge his growing stance in the political field. Churchill was fully aware of the consequences his actions could have if he became unpopular in the House. And it must be questioned here whether Churchill sought and relied on the support of his wife to avoid the same demise his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had faced in the 19th century. Throughout Churchill's career, Clementine shared in her husband's successes. For example, on September 25th, 1924, Clementine wrote how she was proud and longed to assist her husband on, to quote, the new road in which you are setting out. However, from an early point on in their marriage, Clementine also recognised the consequences of her open support and connection to her husband's work. Now, for many, Churchill took an unpopular stance on certain issues, especially but not limited to female suffrage. As a result of this, Clementine was faced with old acquaintances actively avoiding her in the streets to evade being associated with her. This, of course, ultimately caused her much distress. But despite these unpleasant experiences, it did not waver her support for her husband, as she still worked tirelessly to enhance his position. As well as aiding and supporting her husband's career, Clementine was quick to jump to his defence. In public, Clementine would often respond to heckling from the crowds, while in West Leicester, responding to claims that Churchill was, in fact, a warmonger, Clementine, in his defence, commented, to quote, "A lot of people think he is essentially military. In fact, one of his greatest talents is the talents of peacemaking." This level of defence also shows up in Clementine's private correspondence, even in communication with those in high office. The most significant occasion this happened was in 1915, after Churchill was removed from office as First Lord of the Admiralty. Clementine, at this point, experienced the pain Churchill suffered in not having the opportunity to fully explain his actions at Gallipoli, as he now sat analysing the sequences which resulted in his downfall. Witnessing this, Clementine in fact wrote to the Prime Minister Herbert Asquith on May 20th, 1915, arguing that the Prime Minister would be committing an act of weakness by removing Churchill from office, and that in wasting this valuable war material, you will be doing injury to this country. For many, this had been the first time a politician's wife had directly involved themselves in government matters, and was in fact met with some criticism, even from other politicians' wives. When the Prime Minister showed this letter to his wife, Margaret Asquith, she wrote in her diary that the letter contained, to quote, "a touch of blackmail." The Prime Minister actually turned around and defended Clementine's reaction, stating that it was the letter of a wife, to which Margot quickly snapped, "A fishwife, you mean?" Now, despite this criticism, what this letter shows is Clementine's growing confidence as she openly criticises the Prime Minister's actions. However, critically, the letter could have had the potential to cause further damage to Churchill's career, with his wife's actions possibly making him appear weak and unable to speak for himself. But this was not the case. From instances such as this, Clementine began to gain some vital skills which would prove crucial to her development as a public figure. What we see even in these early years is Clementine displaying the ability to go far beyond the work of her predecessors and other politicians' wives of the period. In late 1915, Clementine would again face a new challenge, as Churchill now headed to the front line. In November 1915, in a letter of resignation to the Prime Minister as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, a position which Churchill held after the Admiralty, Churchill wrote, to quote, "I am an officer, and I place myself unreservedly at the disposal of the military authorities." While Churchill was on the front line, Clementine would have to act as his emotional support while simultaneously maintaining his political reputation at home. Clementine, having observed the political field for a number of years at this stage, had built up an understanding of the mechanics of politics, which would now be vital to her husband's political survival. Throughout the war, Clementine, as Lord Beaverbrook described on the night Churchill left the front, remained calm and collected, in the reassurance that her husband would return, believing, as Churchill did, that destiny had bigger things planned for his future. Various correspondence can be found during this period between Churchill and Clementine, with some describing the horrific scenes of war, with Churchill writing in one letter, to quote, "how graves were built into the defences." To comfort her husband, we see Clementine in some letters sending poems, such as Christina Rossetti's Uphill, as she looked to keep his morale high. However, for Clementine, her even greater work during this period took place on the home front. Now, as well as conducting her own war work in war canteens, working with organisations such as the British Red Cross, Clementine also worked tirelessly to maintain her husband's political standings. Churchill's courage in France had created what Clementine referred to as a military halo, aiding the regrowth of his public reputation as he stood alongside British troops. To further this regrowth, Clementine utilised her newly acquired skill set to charm and manipulate ministers, engineering lunches and events with cabinet ministers and liaising with the press. Clementine was able to gain further support for her husband as she portrayed to an even wider audience his courage in France. Creating and reinstating these connections between ministers and the Churchills meant Clementine was able to stay within this inner circle of politics, learn of developments, and inform her husband of any changes or advancements taking place. Now, these relationships and Clementine's work in maintaining them would be a key player in Churchill's reinstatement in high office. In monitoring this political situation, Clementine was also able to advise Churchill on when would be a suitable time to return from the front. Now, of course, Churchill was eager to return to the political world. However, Clementine advised to quote, "Your motives for going to the front was easy to understand. Your motives for coming back require explanation." Having worked in munition canteens and campaigning in Churchill's Dundee constituency, Clementine at this stage understood the mood of the public and knew that it would not be valuable for Churchill to return instantly. When advising Churchill, Clementine had to manipulate him in a way which made him feel he'd made the decision for himself. Now, this method was perfectly summed up by Jock Colville, who used the following metaphor to quote, "In the long, the sparkling water that dripped on the stone made an impression on its surface." The lessons and skills which Clementine had to utilise and learn during the First World War as a confidant to her husband, political advisor, and a woman of war would all become crucial skills for the Second World War with her husband at the helm. At Britain's hour of need, Churchill became the nation's wartime Prime Minister on May 10th, 1940, with Clementine's role now also intensifying. During the Second World War, Clementine became a popular public figure in her own right, not only for her work alongside her husband, but for her own war work as well. As I've mentioned, Clementine was far more than a viable political wife. Her strengths went beyond that of her predecessors, which to begin with actually caused some concerns to Downing Street staff as the Churchills entered number 10. Churchill's private secretary, Jock Colville, recorded in his diary how Clementine saw, to quote, "her mission in life to put others in their place and took pride in her outspokenness." Now, despite these initial concerns, the Downing Street staff soon recognised how crucial Clementine would be for them in maintaining Churchill, with her being one of the few Churchill would listen to. When there was a matter in government, Clementine would be notified by staff in an attempt to resolve it when others were unable to. For example, on June 27th, 1940, after hearing word from Cabinet of concerns over Churchill's attitude, Clementine, in a letter to Churchill, warned him to quote, "There is danger of your being generally disliked by your colleagues." As she informed him, "You are not so kind as you used to be." Now, after this letter was sent, Jock Colville recalled how Churchill's, to quote, "ill-tempered phrases had passed and Clementine's intervention was a success." Now, it must be questioned here why Clementine made this warning to Churchill in a letter. One of the ways Clementine had learned to understand Churchill's mind was that he would take note and act upon something much more effectively when presented to him in writing rather than verbally communicated to him. Therefore, Clementine ensured that when an issue of importance came up, it would always be communicated to her husband via a letter. This was a technique that Clementine advised both ministers and family members to use, and can be seen throughout various collections of correspondence. Clementine had learned to control and mediate Churchill better than anyone, and often proved a great support to those working with Churchill when mediation was required and no one else could work out what to do. On occasions to prevent unrest, Clementine would proclaim, "Now, Winston, that's all right. the subject can be let the rest for the moment. Now, General Sir Frederick Pyle, who observed these mediation skills, recalled how, to quote, "She bossed him, but in the most delightful way, with the deepest understanding of his nature." Even when it came to matters such as Churchill's safety, Clementine once again would be called upon. Now, it's well known that Churchill took great excitement and interest in danger, but when Prime Minister and leading the nation, his safety became a major concern to many. Various politicians from the period have noted how Churchill took them to the roof of number 10 at night to observe the battle in the sky. With others unable to prevent this, to ensure his safety, Clementine uniquely authorised an espionage network of staff who would inform her when her husband sought to go out into the danger. Now, during the height of the Blitz, Churchill would also often leave the safety of number 10 altogether and go into the bomb streets of London to observe the damage inflicted. Now, this, of course, caused great panic as ministers attempted to stop him, but to no prevail. In manipulating Churchill to prevent him from going out, Clementine this time joined him in the danger. General Ismay recalled how, this time, concerned for her safety, he returned before nightfall. It's apparent here that Clementine ultimately put herself in harm's way to prevent her husband from continuing with such endeavours, as he now realised she would accompany him and he did not want her in harm's way. Now, this was a subtle action, but betrays that Clementine knew precisely how to manage Churchill and protect the man needed to lead the war. Other examples of this technique include when Churchill refused to use the bulletproof car, which was provided to the Prime Minister. Learning of his refusal and to ensure that Churchill had no choice but to use it, Clementine would ensure that all other cars were away from Downing Street, leaving the Prime Minister with no other choice. Again, this was another small act, but a crucial one. On one trip, shrapnel actually hit the side of the bulletproof car which Churchill was travelling in. If this had been an ordinary car, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Clementine's skills of manipulating Churchill away from the danger was heavily relied on for the entirety of the war, and her espionage network proved a great success in protecting the Prime Minister. Now, as I've mentioned, Clementine's popularity was enhanced through the war, as she was often seen accompanying Churchill on many of his blitz tours around the nation. It became clear the public in fact longed to see her, just as much as they longed to see her husband. It was again Lord Ismay who stated that the public regarded Clementine as an angel of mercy, who possessed a great calming effect on others. This certainly proved to be the case. When on tour of the Blitz city of Plymouth in May 1941, images were published in the press showing Clementine as a major player in Churchill's entourage. One observer in Plymouth wrote how, to quote, "There was much pleased feminine comment on Mrs. Churchill's striking appearance. Snow leopard coat with flaunt sleeves, a coloured handkerchief over her head, with phrases of her husband's speeches printed on them. It may seem odd it was Clementine's fashion which is commented on here. However, it can be argued that Clementine's distinctive style acted as a morale boost for many, as it demonstrated the nation's courage with the symbolism of her husband's speeches on the headwear. This image of Clementine was partly one constructed by the press, similar to how the media comments on politicians' fashion today, but also one which was utilised as a weapon by Clementine and Number 10, as they recognised the power it had in providing the public with some glamour in time of darkness, portraying brighter days to come. Now, in examining the damage and talking to members of the public, it allowed Clementine to connect with them, not only as a public figure, but as a woman, wife, and mother. This created this personal touch to Clementine's relationship with the British public, and it's here that we see this great calming effect that Lord Ismay described with Clementine's presence on such tours. Clementine proved throughout the war that she could connect with the people openly, not only through these tours, but through public broadcasts. These interactions proved successful not only in Britain, but abroad as well. In a 1944 broadcast to the United States, Clementine spoke of the unity between Britain and the US and thanked them for their noble aid. She commented, to quote, "Out of that unity has sprung the wonderful strength and efficiency we have seen on the battlefront today. Let us give these joint forces of our united people every ounce of support in their tremendous enterprise. Let us see them through." Through the public's reaction, it became clear that Clementine had won over the American public, with the Washington Times announcing her to be, to quote, "Winston's greatest asset," a statement which was echoed around the world at various points. Her global popularity was further reflected through her growing postbag of letters from admiring fans. Clementine's own work at times meant she was unable to accompany her husband, and aware of this, she ensured that a family member would always be available to do so when she could not be around. Now, this duty would often fall upon one of the couple's daughters, ordinarily either Sarah or Mary. As a role model to her daughters, Clementine demonstrated a woman's skills and ability in a male-dominated political world. She had proved to many, including her husband, what a woman was capable of achieving politically, even though not a minister herself. Growing up around the mother and undertaking their work in women's services with Mary in the ATS and Sarah in the WEF meant they had both received significant training to undertake the role as their father's ADC on tour. In 1945, Sarah in fact accompanied her father to the Yalta Conference. In a letter to her mother, Sarah notes that Churchill commented to her while in Yalta, to quote, "I do not suppose that at any moment in history has the agony of the world been so great or widespread. Tonight, the sun goes down on more suffering than ever before in the world." While reporting of her father's progress and her experiences, Sarah described how she'd seen some of that agony in Russia. When unable to accompany her husband, Clementine ensured that her family kept her updated on his operations, with letters such as this allowing her to continue monitoring his progress. It was with her own war work that Clementine's talents as a political figure and humanitarian truly shone, however. In succeeding Lady Halifax as president of the Young Women's Christian Association in February 1941, Clementine took on the responsibility of the appeal. During her duration as president from 1941 to 1949, Clementine raised over £1,250,000 for the funds, with donations being requested through public broadcasts and newspapers. For example, on June 11th, 1945, The Times published a report from Clementine requesting donations to help raise £200,000 for the organisation, to allow it to continue its vital work in supporting women workers. These funds were used to provide new hostels and canteens for women workers, many of whom would have been far from home. Even after the war, Clementine's commitment to the organisation continued, and on March 23rd, 1947, she announced that 22 new hostels had been opened over the year, a significant success despite the organisation's lack of funds. Jock Colville was one who recognised Clementine's growing success in such organisations. He wrote in his diary on March 3rd, 1945, that Clementine could not have done her job better or addressed an audience more effectively when called upon to do so. However, amongst all of Clementine's personal war work, the most significant was the Aid to Russia Fund, which she became chair of in 1941. The fund was set up with the aim of raising money to send to Russia to help provide medical supplies and clothing, with the use of public appeals. In its first 12 days of operation, the fund raised £370,000. And by December 1941, it had already exceeded its initial target of raising £1 million. For her success with the fund in 1945, Clementine was invited on a tour of Russia by the Russian Red Cross. When on the tour, Clementine wrote to her husband on April 12th, describing the devastation in which she had witnessed, with children being treated for starvation as a result of the blockade. Despite the suffering, however, the entourage were met by the adoring Russian public, with Clementine writing how they were mobbed by friendly crowds. Grace Hamlin, Clementine's private secretary, who in fact accompanied her in Russia, recalled how the fund aimed to originally provide 500 beds to each large hospital. But once Clementine had seen the devastation for herself, it was decided the provision of beds should be doubled. By the end of 1948, the Red Cross had raised £7.8 million under Clementine's fund alone. The Russia Fund also, however, provided a significant political opportunity for Churchill, with the prospect of improving international relations with Russia. In a top-secret telegram to Clementine, Churchill requested that while on tour, she expressed his desire for a continuing friendship with Russia to enhance their efforts in creating peace. In an attempt to express Britain's sympathy to Russia, Churchill further explained to Stalin himself how the fund was not just from Britain's elite, but from the poor who were proud to make small weekly contributions to support British allies. Churchill himself recognised the success of Clementine's tour and its impact on the Russian people. In a telegram to his wife on May 4th, Churchill wrote, "You seem to have had a triumphant tour, and I only wish matters could be settled between you and the Russian common people. However, there are many other aspects of problems than those you have seen." As Churchill described himself, Clementine was the one bright star in Anglo-Russian relations, with the fund illustrating the success of Clementine's work on an international scale, not only as a humanitarian, but as a political diplomat in international relations. A 1953 report by Lawrence Thompson described how Clementine had ultimately, to quote, "sustained a nation in sustaining Churchill." The early political years, a period of political estrangement, and 2 world wars all had a significant toll on both Churchill and Clementine. In 1945, Lady Diana Cooper had asked Clementine about life after the war. Clementine had expressed to her how she believed that they, being Churchill and Clementine, would not survive the war. To quote, "We're putting all we have into the war, and it will take all we have." Even while serving as Prime Minister, Churchill was still confined in Clementine and told her secret knowledge of operations, which lay heavily on her shoulders. On June 5th, 1944, the eve of D-Day, Churchill told Clementine to quote, "Do you realise that by the time you wake up, 20,000 men may have been killed?" The knowledge of such secret information like this put a barrier up in Clementine's life, as she was unable to speak to friends. Sylvia Henley, a close friend and relative, claimed she felt that Clementine had, to quote, "pushed her away to avoid leaking any secrets." It must also be assumed that in some cases, Clementine would in fact know more about current and future military operations than many of those in the House of Commons and even at times Cabinet. In the recollections of one woman whose office overlooked Downing Street Park, she observed how she would often witness Clementine walk alone in the park, presumably with the thoughts of the war burdening her mind. After having committed so many years to politics and the hardship of war, the toll was very apparent. After the election defeat of 1945, it was no secret that Clementine hoped that Churchill would not run for a second term, as she now longed for a peaceful retirement with her much-loved husband. But this was not to be the case, with Churchill returning to office as Prime Minister in 1951. Even the press recognised that Clementine was the only one who possessed real control over Churchill, but even as late as 1954, with his health declining, Clementine could not persuade Churchill to resign. Despite it being no secret in the political sphere that Clementine was desperate for a quiet life away from Parliament, she of course still supported Churchill's career, working to protect his, to quote, "unimprovable reputation." She worked like a lioness defending her young, still continuing her ardent work alongside her husband, but the toll was apparent on both of their health. Eventually, as a result of this ever-declining health, Churchill resigned as Prime Minister on April 5th, 1955, but continued as an MP in the House. This was the first step in relieving the pressure from both Churchill and Clementine's shoulders. Later on, in 1963, after major health concerns, Clementine now longed for Churchill to retire from politics completely. However, Clementine was aware that she herself could not ask Churchill to retire, as she believed he would resent this bitterly. Therefore, Clementine would have to indirectly persuade Churchill to do so. On Clementine's request and behalf, on March 18th, 1963, the Churchill's private secretary, Anthony Montague Brown, wrote to Churchill's Woodford constituency manager, Doris Moss, requesting that the Conservative Association now informed Churchill of the, to quote, growing opposition to him standing as MP again as a result of his health. Churchill received a letter describing the association's growing concerns and how, if he announced retirement now, it would allow them time to find a suitable successor. Churchill accepted this resignation, writing to Moss that despite the sadness he felt at retiring as a result of poor health, he took honour and privilege in having served the House of Commons for 60 years. After, Clementine thanked Moss for her courage in what must have been a painful task. These sources show us how Clementine was able to indirectly intervene in Churchill's career as she used secret communications to organise a safe and practical step back to protect Churchill's health and reputation once more. As discussed, political life put a heavy strain on Clementine's shoulders, but despite this, she continued to perform her role admirably. Many comments have been made on the mental strain politics had on Churchill, but very few look at the impact it had on Clementine. Throughout life, it was Clementine who upheld Churchill as he turned to her in times of low, as he was able to expose his vulnerabilities and emotions. Churchill's trust and admiration for his wife was a credit to her character and strength. From 1908 on their marriage, Clementine had dedicated so much to ensure his success on the political stage. She had shared in his successes, but also in the moments of distraught. It must not be forgotten that the Churchills also had a family to care for and maintain alongside this political life. For Clementine, despite the support she received, life was relentless. Suffering political setbacks, family devastations, and untold emotions, the Churchills faced many challenges, but through it all, they stayed united under the mutual aim of Churchill's destiny. Where Churchill had painting and bricklaying as an emotional release, Clementine turned to her children and holidaying abroad as a source of relaxation. Clementine simply believed that her epitaph would read, to quote, "Here lies a woman who was always tired, because she lived in a world where too much was required." Now, being married to Churchill could certainly have been no easy task. It demanded someone with the strength and patience Clementine possessed to be able to maintain his often chaotic lifestyle. Clementine herself actually admitted to their daughter Mary that it took all her time and strength to keep up with him. In writing a foreword for Fishman's biography of Clementine, the former First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who herself understood the pressures all too well of being married to a public man, claims that to have a successful marriage, one has to be armed with infinite patience, an attribute she acknowledged Clementine certainly possessed. It becomes clear to me when looking at Churchill and Clementine how perfectly suited they were to one another, but also how perfectly suited they were to the role history would provide them. As Lady Diana Cooper once explained, Clementine possessed the same fearless attitude as her husband. Together, they performed as a political force like no other. Clementine was Churchill's rock, just as much as he was hers, with their marriage full of mutual support and affection for one another. In both public and private, the Churchill marriage was a unique one like no other, and I myself would certainly refer to it as the most crucial marriage of the 20th century. Politically, they achieved so much, as Clementine went beyond any of her predecessors to aid her husband's political voyage. But she also shone in her own spotlight as an ardent political figure. The honour which Clementine valued the most was Churchill's own acknowledgement of her work when he proclaimed, to quote, "I could never have succeeded without her." Through the most turbulent periods of the early 20th century, they rose to a mutual task, one of love and commitment, not only to one another, but to the nation. Now, to finish this presentation, I will end with a quote from Churchill to Clementine, which is, in my opinion, the best way to sum up this talk and their relationship. To quote, "My greatest good fortune in a life full of brilliant experiences has been to find you and to lead my life with you." Thank you very much for listening, and I will pass back to Bethany.
Thank you so much, Elliot. That was really wonderful. And I'm sure that the audience will agree that it's clear you have a formidable future ahead in your academic career. It's no mean feat to be presenting to so many people while you're doing a PhD. So thank you. That was fantastic. Oh, you're muted again. You did a really great job of showing how pivotal Clementine was in supporting and shaping Churchill's political life. And I really loved hearing how you described him, you know, the famous orator running his speeches past Clementine. It's such a domestic dimension to this very public figure. And I also really liked, which some members of the audience have sent me messages about, that she put those important points, when she wanted to make an important point to her husband, she would do it in writing so that he would take notice. And of course, for you, the benefit is that we now have this incredible paper trail and some wonderful primary sources for your research and those of other Churchill scholars. So it's a great way of understanding the dynamics of their relationship. I think, if I may, I'm going to kick off the questions with one of my own. I promise everybody, keep sending your questions and we'll get around to as many as we can. But I'm sure my question hopefully will be of interest to you all as well. I wanted to ask, how did the two meet? And do we know anything about the first impressions?
We absolutely do. So they actually first met in 1904. And this was an event held by Lord and Lady Crewe. And Churchill walked in and instantly spotted Clementine across the room to him. And he actually asked his mother to introduce him. Now, he went over, but the famous wordsmith at this point was speechless. He didn't know what to say, and it came across quite awkward. And Clementine didn't really know what to do. And she actually ushered over a male friend who was there to take her away to dance with him instead of Churchill at that stage. And that was sort of their first meeting in 1904. And it wasn't until 1908 that they were at a dinner event held by Lady St. Helier that they actually started talking properly. Again, they were at the same event. At the table, Churchill was sat opposite Clementine. And after the dinner, he went up to her and spent the whole evening talking to her. He actually promised on that evening that he'd send her a copy of his biography of his father, Lord Randolph, but that copy was never sent. But one thing he did do was invite both Clementine and her mother to Salisbury Hall, which was his mother's home, to have a second meeting. And then later on, they went to Blenheim Palace, obviously connections to Churchill there. And it was at that point that Churchill proposed to Clementine for marriage. But the story goes that they were out on a walk for the grounds, which Churchill was already late to, which Clementine wasn't too impressed by. And it started raining. So they went to a small Greek temple, which is by the river at Blenheim, I believe. And they sat down in there sheltering from the rain. Clementine noticed a spider walking across the ground. And she had decided that if the spider hadn't crossed, I believe it was the third or fourth tile, then if Churchill hadn't proposed, then she was going to walk away. So the faith of their marriage was sort of held in that mini spider at that point. And luckily for Churchill, he did propose before the spider crossed the fourth tile, which I'm sure he was very pleased about.
From a very fragile beginning there to a very solid relationship. Brilliant, thank you. We've got loads of questions, we've got more coming in, so I'll just get going with a few more. So Eugene asks, which of Winston's behavioural traits did she most successfully manage to curb, rein in, or refashion completely?
I think it was probably to do with his speeches when he would use quite offending phrases at times, and she recognised that. And that's partly because of the speech impediment he had at the time. He obviously became quite frustrated with that, so he was using these phrases. One of the things she did was she made sure that Churchill had a word in his speech which he would repeat multiple times within it. So if we look at some of his speeches during the war, the word victory, it's always repeated multiple times in every sentence because it keeps his mind focused, and that was one of her techniques at that stage. So I think it was he could be quite not aggressive, but come across in that way at times, and she was able to mediate there and be able to be the mediation force behind that.
Brilliant, thank you. Several people have asked a similar question, so I'll ask it in its broadest terms. What policy areas were the most important to Clementine, and where did she have the biggest impact?
Ooh, that's an interesting.
It's a bit of a tricky one.
Yeah, I wouldn't say so much in terms of the policies, but it was very much to do with the charitable work she did during the war. She wanted to have that protection for women workers during the war, especially when her own daughters were in the services. All three daughters at certain points were serving. With Diana was also in the Wrens as well, Mary in the ATS, and Sarah in the WAF. So she was very much focused on the women workers side of things, and then later the Aid to Russia Fund as well. So in terms of the policies, Clementine was very much more liberal than Churchill. Churchill was obviously conservative for much of his life. Clementine didn't intervene in his policy making. That was one thing. It was Churchill's career. And although she may advise at times, she wouldn't actively involve herself in policy making.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that answers quite a lot of the questions that have come in, but we've got plenty more. Someone's asked a very interesting question, which is, to what degree do you think her choice to write to Winston when she wants to make a point was influenced by him being famously very good at oral argumentation? In other words, was it simply too difficult to debate or reason with Winston face to face? Is that why do you think she had to put things in writing? Partly.
I think it could have been the driving force behind it, but I think the main fact was Churchill's mind was constantly on the go. Even if you were talking to him, you can guarantee his mind was probably elsewhere, thinking about the issues within politics and things like that. So I think it's the fact she realized this, and if something is in front of him and he's actually reading it, then he would take note of it. You have to remember, early on in his career, he sat and read so many of his father's speeches. That's how he learned, was through reading. And that was very much the driving force he pushed for his own children. When it came to reading with them, he was very much focused on the letters of communication there as well. So I think letters played a huge part in the Churchill's lifestyle. If you go to the Churchill archives, the vast amount of letters is quite ridiculous at stages. And like you said, the communications between the two of them are really key for historians today. When we look at other politicians of the time, so we look at Stanley Baldwin, for example, there are so few letters between him and his wife because the story goes that they only spent one night apart throughout their marriage. So they didn't need the letters. Clementine and Churchill would often be apart. So it was easier for them to communicate by letter than it was at times to speak.
Brilliant, thank you. So you spoke in your presentation about Clementine's big project with Aid to Russia. Were there any other landmark projects that she was very involved in?
Probably not on the same scale as the Aid to Russia Fund. She was definitely involved in a variety of charities throughout the period, such as the Young Women's Christian Association, which I spoke about, but nothing on the same scale as the Aid to Russia Fund. I think that for her was such a main focus. In fact, she actually wrote a small book about her time in Russia and with the Aid to Russia Fund. So for her, that was sort of her focus for the war, and obviously the great success at £7.8 million over the period up till 1947 was a huge thing for her to achieve.
Lovely. I can see from my messages that we have maybe people struggling with similar issues in their marriages, people asking which of Winston's behaviours did Clementine find most frustrating, do you think?
Oh, in terms of frustrating, probably if you look at the family side of things, it was probably Churchill's relationship with his son Randolph. So this is going into my PhD research a little bit more now. When Randolph was quite a naughty child, he admits that himself in his autobiographies, but Churchill sort of saw it as that's what a boy does. He wouldn't tell him off or punish him in any way, where Clementine probably wanted to say something at that point, but I would say that's probably where she got a bit more annoyed with Churchill's characteristic there. He sort of let his son get away with a few things at times.
Brilliant. We've got a couple of questions on this, which is how did she react to Churchill changing parties, and would it have been difficult for her to switch from one side to another as a wife in the social circles?
But Churchill, on their first meeting, actually, she sort of notes that Churchill was the one that crossed the floor in the house. She knows that already, and she might be a little bit wary of that in 1904. But in terms of her own political opinion, she knew that she wasn't going to express the fact that maybe her thoughts were more liberal than her husband's. You know, she always supported his point of view, his career, and she would never do anything to tarnish his reputation in any way. And that was one of her key points, is that it's Churchill's career and not hers.
Brilliant. Someone's asked, how did she react? I don't know if there's any record of this, but how did she react to him always being short of funds and a bit of a spender?
Churchill was certainly a spender at times. And the key point was when he actually bought Chartwell, he didn't tell Clementine instantly. And once she found out that there was another household to maintain, she wasn't quite so pleased as maybe the children were with this grand new home. A lot had to be done to Chartwell at the time, I believe. So the funds were certainly an issue. It was a major worry for Clementine, and Mary Soames sort of writes that in the years of the darker years, when they were in the 30s, when Churchill was out of office, his wilderness years, as he calls it, that Churchill was almost living from article to article. He was publishing, or book to book at stages as well. So money was always an issue for the Churchills, and that obviously lay heavily on Clementine's shoulders. And obviously, of course, while that's laying on her shoulders, she's also got the political world as well. So it's all building up massively on the pressure on Clementine.
So she handled quite a lot very admirably by the sounds of it.
Absolutely.
Bethan's asked a question which I think might tie in quite well with your current research, which is, you mentioned Mary and Sarah accompanying Winston at times. What was the public's reception of Winston as a father and family man?
The reception was always it was unusual, because although some others did do this at times, they'd take their children on tour, it wasn't seen in the same way as Churchill did. This was quite a huge thing to take Sarah to Yalta, for example, and Catherine Grace Katz's book, The Daughters of Yalta, is very good at explaining that and the importance of having the children there. But it was quite a significant thing, and the way he was seen as a father, especially in the press. You know, as soon as the children were born, they were instantly mentioned in the press. They were always in the public eye, and that would be at times an issue for Churchill. You know, he didn't want his children to be criticised in certain ways for what they were doing, or the decisions in life and things like that. And for his policies as well, he realised that as a politician, that his children would face the backlash at times. So Randolph in school was bullied for his father's involvement with Gallipoli and the Dardanelles and things like that. So it was the impact of that as a father in politics, which is massively what I'm looking at in my current research.
Excellent, thank you. A couple of questions relating to this. Are there records of how Clementine felt about the major political figures she was encountering from other countries, such as Stalin or the Roosevelts?
There were comments made at times in Clementine's correspondence when she was in Russia with Churchill about Stalin. I can't remember from the top of my head right now the comments that were made, but she was always in that world of the political sphere. The people leading the world, she was close to. It's a simple. They all grew up in the same sort of environment. At times, they were the neighbours, even if they're in number 10 or number 11. So they're all quite close. She was concerned at times of the impact other people's reputation could have on her husband if he was too close to them. So that was always a major thing, that she was wary of policy sharing and how close her husband was to certain politicians at certain points.
Yeah, brilliant. We have a question from Eugene. To what degree would you describe their relationship as mutually dependent on a psychological, emotional, romantic, and perhaps social level?
Emotionally, they were very much connected. I think that's from an early point in their marriage. You start to notice that could be a point from childhood, if you want to look into the psychological impact behind that. They both had difficult relationships with fathers at that point. So the connection there was very, very instant. Both of them, before meeting, had been involved with other people. Clementine was engaged before meeting Churchill, but the connection they had was very, very unique. And you see in a way that they form themselves as sort of a political alliance more than anything. And that she's a driving force at times, and Churchill was a driving force. Emotionally, he would rely on her, and emotionally, she would rely on him at times as well. I think the key point there is the death of their daughter Marigold in the early 20s. That emotional point there is huge. It's a huge impact to lose a daughter while also trying to maintain a political reputation at the front as well. So emotionally, they relied on each other so much, and it was a very important part of their relationship. But of course, at times it became very difficult as well, and there was strains put on that relationship.
Thank you. We're still getting loads of questions. I'm aware that I'm firing away, firing them away at you one after the other, and you're holding up very well. I'm sure you must be getting tired. I should say at this point, if you don't mind, Elliot, that if people want to reach out, if we don't get through everything, and people want to reach out to you, they can do that, can't they? If they've got burning questions.
Absolutely. You can contact me via my website or via Twitter as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'll pick a couple more and then we'll let you take a well-earned break. Someone's asked, which I think is a very interesting question, who were some of her close female friends? Do we know?
Oh, I can't think of any names from the top of my head, but Clementine would at times keep herself to herself. I mean, Sylvia Henley was a very close friend, and the contact there was always very important to her in the communications. But because of the world she was in, and she was constantly so busy, or the secret knowledge she knew, she would possibly at times try and hold herself back from being too close to anyone. And the family was always obviously important to her, the time she spent with them. When you've got a political life which you've dedicated so much to, the family is obviously going to have an impact as well. So to try and make time for both of those, and then to also contain many friendships, probably became quite difficult at times.
Yes, she had rather a lot on her plate, didn't she? Sally's asked, do you know if Clementine was in contact with the female commanders of the 3 female military auxiliary services, and if there was possibly a group of ladies behind the great men who could be attributed with so many successful organisations? So do you know the answer to that, or is that one for future research?
I know Clementine was very keen on her daughters joining in with war service, whether that be Mary of the ATS or Sarah of the WAF. And she always was asking them about different operations which they were working on, so they couldn't release too much of what they were working on because of the secrecy behind it. But she was always very keen on keeping an eye on that, especially when even that was being put in the press. You know, Mary was in the Hyde Park Battery, and there's lots of comments about Churchill going to visit her there, and there was a huge press report behind it. And the fact that she would support them in different ways. When Sarah joined the WAF, she didn't want to be known as just the Prime Minister's daughter. So she went with the name Sarah Oliver at that stage rather than Sarah Churchill, but it quickly became known who she was. It was clear it was Sarah Churchill. She'd been in the newspapers, but essentially since she was born. So it wasn't long until that was discovered. But she would always talk to them about what they were doing, and she would support them, especially with the war work. But I'm not sure about the command and information behind them, I'm afraid.
Brilliant, thank you. I think to finish up, I'll ask you one that should hopefully be nice and easy for you to answer, and very informative for us, sorry, because hopefully we'll be able to welcome you back at some point to talk about this more. But could you tell us a bit about what you're working on right now?
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned earlier, I'm looking at fatherhood in the early 20th century in British politics, and then the involvement the fathers had in everyday life of the children. So raising them from a very young age, how were they involved? So this is looking at figures such as Churchill, who's the key case study for this again. What was Churchill really like as a father? Was he involved in the everyday aspect? And there's stories of Churchill like bathing Diana when she's a baby, and the nanny's getting quite frustrated that he's becoming involved. It's something you wouldn't expect because of the work he's doing. People expect him to be quite a distant father, but that's not the case. So that's what I'm trying to show with this study. But I'm also looking at the impact being a politician had on family life. So the impact it had on both the children and the father. If the children did something wrong, it reflected on the father. If the father did anything wrong, it reflected on the children. So it's the impact of that and growing up in the public eye, and the overall impact of being a political father in the early 20th century. And that's not just looking at Churchill, that's looking at other politicians as well. I won't say the other politicians I'm looking at. If you look at my Twitter, you might be able to work that out from the archives I've been in. But yeah, there's a few different people I'm looking at.
Oh, that sounds really fascinating. And as I say, hopefully we'll be able to welcome you back in due course to tell us more about that. You've done a fantastic job. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. Our next talk will take place on the 8th of June, and that talk is entitled Uncertain Empire, Jews, Palestine and the Fate of British Imperialism. So do sign up and join us then. We've had a few questions about whether this is being recorded. It is. I will upload it onto our YouTube channel with our other talks as soon as possible, and I will send out a link to you all with the email addresses you signed up for today. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Elliot. That was fantastic.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for everyone to join us this evening.
Good night, everyone. Thanks again.